Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention. Maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. G'day everybody, welcome back to Voice of Gord. A little quick intro here for you. Wednesday, March 12th, I recorded this interview with a gentleman named Avetis Muradyan a couple of days ago, and I wanted to turn it around and get it out quick, so here it is. I won't bore you too much. Avetis is a writer and a businessman. He's been living in Asia, and he's also got a pretty good insight into how the Canadian government and establishment and ruling elite work and function, and has provided some pretty good historical analysis and comparisons to other regimes, such as the sort of, end of the Soviet Empire. And I think there's some warnings to be heeded in Avetis' work, and also some hopeful possibility. As you'll see in the piece we discussed where he talked about, future expansion up into the Arctic. This was a really good conversation. I really like Avetis, man. His writing is excellent. Can't top that guy enough. Go check out his stuff. Go subscribe to Palladium Mag and IM 1776. Pass this around to your friends. As always, you can get a hold of me, Gordylocks at protonmail.com. If you like what you hear, go to my Substack, autonomoustruckers.substack.com. Smash that subscribe button. I'm writing a book on trucking, coming out in early 2026, End of the Road, Inside the War on Truckers. If you want to help me out with that, there'll be links to that in the show notes. And okay, let's get to Mr. Avetis Muradyan. G'day everybody. Welcome back to another fantastic episode of the Voice of Gord podcast. I'm Gord, and this is my voice. The other voice you're about to hear is a gentleman whose writings I've been enjoying from afar, kinda. He's got some very deep and contextually important things to say about the state of Canada today, through his very clearly well understood history of the place, what's going on with what we might call the Laurentian elite, and how it compares to other nations that have faced decline and the precipice of not being what they once were. Yet he's also optimistic and is a believer in what Canada could be. One of his most recent articles was just this amazing, peon to the, development of the Arctic. And I think everybody should go and read it. I'm very, very happy to bring you the other voice you're about to hear today, a gentleman by the name of Avetis Muradyan. Did I get your name right, sir?
Avetis Muradyan, yes, that's great. Close enough, as they say. Thanks for having me, Gord.
Yeah, I was listening to one of your other podcasts. Usually people call you Avi.
Yeah, shorter. You can do that too. I don't mind. Yeah, it's easier.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks, Avi. Well, thank you for coming. They say you can just do things, and one of the things you can just do is look people up online and find their email addresses and cold call them and be like, "Hey, man, you want to come on my podcast and talk about all these awesome ideas?" And here you are. Before we get into, there's two specific pieces of writing you've put out that I want to discuss, and on all the ideas contained therein. Give us a little biography about yourself, and your travels and how you came to be where you are now.
Sure, I'd be very happy to. Thanks for having me, of course. Thanks for the invitation. I always appreciate these conversations. These are great. I think people underestimate the impact that a lot of these conversations can have on people. It gets the ideas flowing. It also creates communities where people can, as you said, reach out to each other, have conversations, organize. As for myself, my biography is pretty simple. I'm a Montrealer. I did some of my schooling in the US. So I got to see the United States a bit. I studied at UBC out on the West Coast in Vancouver. I'm a graduate from the Department of Computer Science. I also have a degree in English literature. Um, I went to China when I was 22 with my startup, and I kind of stayed in Asia after that for a good little while until I came back a few months ago. I lived all over Asia. I worked a couple of years in China. I worked in Singapore mostly. I also worked in Thailand. And I got to do business in places like Cambodia and Burma. My primary industries are medical technologies. So I work I worked in the psychiatry field for many, many years. Also worked in logistics, transportation, and supply chains. It was very, very fascinating. That was the Southeast Asian experience. Um, and I got to see a lot of the world and do a lot of things I wouldn't have been able to do in Canada. And one of the reasons I, of course, left was because the prospects weren't so great, even for someone with what is usually considered a great degree, like a computer science degree. People say you can make a very good living and so on. But I thought that my opportunities were fairly limited, even at the time. Right, this was the mid 2010s, late 2010s. So I decided to get up and leave.
So I think you and I have somewhat similar trajectory in life, if maybe for different reasons and in
Hmm.
different fields. I'm a trucker, but I
Hmm.
thought, why let the oceans get in my way? So I went and drove truck in New Zealand and Australia and did the
It's awesome.
backpacking thing. I went to Asia, but instead of like, making money, I just went to sort of like hang around in Thailand and Bali and party and stuff.
Wasn't that
so
great? That was a great time, I'm sure.
yeah, I didn't sort of get the deep understanding that one has from living and working there. I do have a friend though. I'm going to shout this guy out. I'm not going to say his real name, but he's from Toronto. He's a corporate lawyer, a very
Hmm.
good friend of mine. I'm going to send him this episode, and he's a little bit older than me, but he speaks, reads, and writes fluently in Cantonese. Although he's not, he's Canadian, and he
Hmm.
lived in China for 10 years. Did the corporate law thing. He works at a
Hmm.
firm in New York City now, but he still lives in Canada. Does like corporate business law between China and North America. Understands all that stuff. And one of the things I really like about this gentleman is he takes no crap from Trudeau, the government, from the Biden regime, from the blob, from the sort of authoritarian managerial elite and their harpies, because he's lived in China and seen how the sort of Chinese Communist Party operates and how things go there. And he sees these sort of like, concerning parallels emerging here in North America. And so another reason I wanted to have you on is like as someone with your experience and your pedigree, so to speak, um, you've probably got some wisdom for those of us wondering exactly what's going on here right now.
I don't know if I have wisdom. I think I would take a very different approach to your friend. Like, I enjoyed my time in China. I thought it was a pretty well-run country. There's obviously things which are strange and different, but overall, I think a lot of what's happening here in Canada is like orders of magnitude worse than anything that I saw over there, to be entirely honest. So,
Oh wow, do
uh,
tell, please, by all means.
um, the kind of coercion that you get in Canada is very structural and it's very overt. I'll give you an example. The Chinese really hate violence. They really don't like getting into violent confrontation. That includes government officials. They don't want to have to crack down ever. They'll do everything. They'll do persuasion. They'll try to cut a deal with you. Um, and overall, there's like an avoidance of violence. Violence is seen as a failure. Whereas if you look at the crackdown on the trucker convoy protests, right, that was absolutely brutal. It was just a regular protest. People were making a little bit of sound, and they basically flew in police forces from all over the country to uh, basically beat people into submission. Like there's like that sort of thing wouldn't happen in China at that level unless you were like there was no threat to the state, there was no threat of causing the collapse of Canada or anything like that. But you would not see like that sort of knee-jerk reaction in a place like China. They would come, try to negotiate, have a talk, sit down with you. It's a lot softer in that sense, right?
For the people whose only point of reference to China, either through their own
Mm,
ignorance or just the way that the media works, and like I'm saying, I'm not here to like pump up the Chinese Communist Party. I
mm.
don't know, but when you say something like you just said, I can already hear people's brains exploding, saying, "Well, what about Tiananmen Square? What about what happened during COVID?" Right? Like, do you have like is there some middle where you can meet with those criticisms?
Yeah, yeah, sure. In 1989, when the protests were going on in Eastern Europe, all the communist governments collapsed, right? So what the Chinese did saw that as like, well, we're going to collapse as well. So they didn't go very hard. It escalated very quickly, and it became extremely violent, right? So that's an example. COVID as well. I heard some pretty gnarly stories from when that happened. I don't know why it happened. Um, I'm not gonna like blow hot air up people's ass for over this. It's true. It probably was pretty brutal. Like people were locked in their homes and it's completely disorganized. Some people couldn't go out for food. So there was a reason why it reaches that level of coercion in China, and it's quite rare. But on a modus operandi, I was there last year as well. I was in Shenzhen. Like when it operates normally, it operates fairly like regularly. And even when you have protests in China quite a lot. There's discontent for a variety of reasons. First of all, the Chinese government, one of the things that they love doing is they sit down with you and they try to listen why the thing that you're upset about is happening. I'll give you a very good example. When I was in China in 2017, 2018, the pollution was horrendous. It was just awful. Um, that was one of the main reasons where people were leaving. We're like, we have kids, we can't have people growing up in this polluted places. And when I came back last year, I visited again. The air was clean. They had fixed it. The whole EV green revolution, regardless of what you think of it, was used to essentially clean up the air and deal with the pollution issues that people were complaining about.
Right. So
Um,
how old are you, Avi?
I'm 29, actually. Yeah.
Oh, okay. You're just a young fella. I'm 46. I got a little way on you yet. So the only reason I asked that is you use this example of how they've cleaned themselves up a bit. When I was a kid, when I was 9, 10 years old in the late 1980s, there was um, there was an agreement between the Mulroney government in Canada and that of Ronald Reagan about cleaning up the air because it was the sort of acid rain was the term that was out there. And when I was a kid, my dad and I liked to go fishing. So did my uncles. Like we were typical sort of like, I
Mm,
wasn't from like Toronto or anything. Like I grew up out in the woods,
mm,
and we all like to go fishing. And the provincial government used to publish these books that would tell you how many fish of each species you could eat from every lake in the province of Ontario. They gave these guides away. It was almost like a
mm.
mini telephone book, right? Because the acid rain was basically making all of the fish in Ontario and Quebec toxic because
Yeah.
there was like this weight, like the predominant winds would push all of this pollution, this air pollution from the Midwest and the Ohio Valley north and east, and it would come into Ontario and Quebec. And the Mulroney government and the Reagan government in the US had these meetings about it. And that's when they started putting in the scrubbers on coal fired power plants. And they started doing all this stuff in the late 80s and early 90s. And like, I understand sometimes there's a fight between environmental regulation and when it goes too far. And then there's also the legitimate concerns about, we all want clean
Mm.
air and water and soil and food. And but those acid rain accords actually worked. Like Mulroney and Ronald Reagan actually cleaned the air for Eastern Canada.
Yeah, and it's not a bad thing, right? So, yeah, environmental regulations could be used, especially in Canada. They are used to cripple economic development. Like they're used as an excuse, but it doesn't mean that environmental regulations in and of themselves are bad. And from my Chinese example, like the Chinese were pissed off. That was one of the main reasons they had discontent toward their government was actually the pollution, right? It wasn't like political freedoms. It's not a country that particularly cares about that. It was literally like pollution was terrible, so you guys better fix it. And they did. It was a big deal. Like they invested a lot of money in fixing it, and I think that's good. It's a positive development, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think your most recent Asian position was down in Singapore.
Last time I was working was in a town called Chiang Mai up north in Thailand. So I was working in logistics there, supply chains all across Southeast Asia. We would facilitate trade between supply chains between Burma, so Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia.
Oh, okay. No, I thought I read somewhere you were in Singapore as well.
I was in Singapore before being in Thailand, yeah, for several years. My company is still based. The company that I own, I'm no longer working there, but I'm one of the shareholders of the company is still based in Singapore and operating well. Yeah.
Right. I remember being in Chiang Mai, and Chiang Mai kind of like sort of sits in this valley. And
Yes.
I remember the sort of, I don't know if it was fog, smog, or haze, but you
In
couldn't see
April, was it in April?
you couldn't see very far.
Yeah, it's because they're burning the virgin forest to clear out space to plant. It's an agricultural rural region, right? So for one or two around planting season in April, it gets really, really bad, right?
Oh, okay. Wow,
Mhm.
interesting. So supply chains, I didn't realize you're also working in that space. I mean, hey, I spent most of my life in one of those links. So,
Yeah, and I enjoyed it much more than like in the highbrow psychiatry biopharma world. Um, that was way more fun. I really liked the characters I've worked with. That was like one of the best experiences in my life, to be honest.
oh, cool. All right. So let's get into it here. You wrote a very, I would say it's not like super long, but a somewhat lengthy essay for these guys called Palladium Magazine back in 2019, and I've been sharing it around back channel for a couple of years. And I have some friends who are aware of it and have read it and are in agreement with the sort of conclusions you come to and understand what's going on. But some people may not have, and I want to encourage them to. And I want to discuss what you lay out in this article and then what's happening in Canada right now, right? So it's called How Not to Build a Country, Canada's Late Soviet Pessimism. And I think, as far as our discussion about now, or the questions I want to ask you about what's happening in Canada right now, your opening paragraph sort of sums it up pretty good here, right? So I'm just going to read this. Um, our excursions have become a personal tradition. Every year I reduce my career expectations, says T. Most conversations in Vancouver go something like this, although rarely with such candor. There is always some gnawing concern, and eventually it becomes the only thing worth mentioning. Vancouverites have a cold, polite distance when talking about their lives and anxieties, a general tone of neutrality and understatement, followed by an innocuous excuse for the banality of the subject. Excitement is not part of the repertoire. Things are either exactly the same or vaguely less tolerable. All aspects of life are circulate through this filter: dating, work, shopping, even the weather. So this opening salvo in this essay, which goes on to sort of discuss a few different things that, like, Canadians that are paying attention, or maybe a better way to put it is Canadians who've traveled and spent any amount of time outside the country will sort of understand, right? Like, um, Canadian society and Canadian culture is a very sort of unique thing, and it's somewhat insular in its own way, right? Like,
Yes, yeah.
it's very self-referential. There's a term called navel gazing, which commentators have been using for years. It's not new.
Mm.
And there's this sort of mentality that CBC and what I like to call Cathedral North, to borrow
Mm,
from Curtis Yarvin's
hmm.
neologism, have engendered this attitude like, because we live next door to the US, we must at all costs constantly talk about ourselves, constantly think of everything as a reaction to or opposition to or comparison with the United States. And it kind of it builds this like weird helplessness and a different type of reactionary attitude when anyone tries to criticize what's going on in Canada. It's sort of business environment, it's political environment, the expectations of its citizenry. And I've read a few. There's a sort of ancient Canadian historian, this guy named Pierre Burton, and he wrote books about like the Klondike Gold Rush and the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And Burton, I can't remember if he lays it out explicitly, but it's sort of implied that like the Canadian Pacific Railway was built in part to keep the Americans out. It was like, okay, if we don't do something with this land, you know, like there's this proposition of what, British North America is going to become. We can't get Vancouver to sign up unless we build a rail line. The Americans are talking about manifest destiny. We got to keep them out. And then in his book about the Klondike Gold Rush, most of the people up in the Yukon digging out the gold were Americans, right? Most of the labor that worked on building the Canadian Pacific Railway, or I shouldn't say the labor, but the engineers and the people who actually build it were also Americans. So there's this like weird, like, oh, we have to fight them off. Oh, we have to do this exciting thing, but we're only doing it because of the Americans. There's just this like, there's this thing where like Canada just cannot ever get the United States out of its head in order to be its own thing, right? So like, I think the rest of your essay here speaks to that greatly.
Yeah, the second one, the Arctic Gambit, was particularly touches on that. And the second part of it is like, well, Canada is not the US. Like, it's clearly not. It has a very different development model, and it has very different security concerns, right? We built the railway partially to lay a claim to the land, right? So there was security concerns, basically, like we have to keep the Americans out, so we have to build this railway. But one of the first uses of the Canadian Pacific Railway was to put down the Métis Rebellion in Manitoba, right? So this is like at the beginning of the Canadian Confederation, the beginning of the Canadian state. One of the first uses is actually to put down a rebellion. So now that you think back about the trucker convoy events that we had a couple of years ago, people were shocked by this. They're like, we live in a democracy. How can this sort of thing happen? But it's like, well, it's always been like this. This is how the Canadian state was built. It's in its DNA. It's the kind of reflexes that are inborn. And like it's muscle memory of the state just exercising what it knows, what to do, and what it knows what to do very well is to put down rebellions. So even something that we think about as like an economic corridor, right? The Canadian Pacific Railway sent us like, oh, this is how we built the West, this is how we economically developed, was actually born out of security concerns, and mostly security concerns against the United States, right?
Right. And in that article you just recently published at IM 1776, G'day Mark Granza and
Mm,
Ben Braddock and Lafayette Lee and all the other
mm,
Anons that working right over there. I did a couple articles for them a few years ago too.
no,
Maybe I should pitch them on something.
yeah, you should.
uh,
Absolutely.
um, the Arctic thing. Most people who like understand Canada and like some Americans that also get this, you know, 80 to 85% of Canada's population lives within 100 miles of the United States border, right? We're sort of huddled along the 49th parallel, mostly along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. The Arctic is a place that's romanticized, but is actually a distant thing most people have no idea about. Like, if you took 100 average Canadians and asked them if they've ever been to Nunavut or even knew what it was, you're talking single digits, less than 10% anyway. Same with the Northwest Territories, the Yukon. Like most people don't go up there. And then when they do, so I lived in Yellowknife for 4 years. I should say 4 winters I spent up that way. Did a couple of seasons hauling fuel in the pre-haul in the fall. I met a local there and dated her for a while and kind of lived in her little miner's cabin in the old town part of Yellowknife. And I tried to sort of take it all in while I was there. And there's two types of people that live in Yellowknife. Okay, for the most part, they will fall into one of these camps. They're either dyed in the wool Northerners, born, bred, never leaving. They love the North, um, or they moved there when they were younger and never left. They loved it and stayed. Right. So there's some variation of I really like living in the North. This is great. I'm never going back. You know, those people down south are crazy. Civilization sucks. I want to hang out in the woods in the Yellowknife, right? And then there's the bureaucrats and the government people and the contract workers who may be either it's opportunistic or perhaps I think what animated some of these people was the sort of romanticism about the North. They might be from Ottawa or the Toronto area, Montreal, Vancouver, and they read about the North and then they get some, government job opportunity up there and they sign up for a contract. They go work for some bureaucracy because Yellowknife is a government town. It's a government town and it's a mining town. That's it. And they come up and they're all starry eyed about it. And then they realize what living in the North actually means. And then they're gone. They fulfill their contract and they never come back. Right. So this sort of like weird dichotomy between the 100 milers, the people that live along the US border, and then the extremely tiny percentage of people in Canada that understand what the Arctic and what the North actually means. Like, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why why we settled people 100 kilometers from the US border was to actually hold the border. Uh, that's why we built the Canadian Pacific Railway so close to the US border as well, so we could settle around there, um, and hold it. But there was no reason why Canada couldn't have been more spaced out, right? And the way our country is built is very strange. I think about it this way: in like a lot of the even major provinces, like let's take Ontario or Quebec or BC, you'll have a major metropolis, right? Like you'll have a major city like Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal. And then the second largest city will be like an order of magnitude smaller. So we concentrate around these like big urban agglomerations around the border, and we've simply decided not to spread out our population even before we even get to the Arctic Northern Territories, right? Um, this was done at the time because there were concerns around security when we built the country this way. But there's no reason why it should be that this way anymore, right? And we just haven't changed. It's one of those things where it's like it's muscle memory. Um, and we have to stop and think like maybe this thing isn't really working. Maybe we need better second or third larger cities that are like comparable in population to the larger cities. But also like why is the north completely unpopulated, right? Why is it just government towns and mining towns, right? Can we do something more with it, right?
Right. So that question brings me back to your or the original article, the first one I read about from yourself, this late Soviet pessimism, and that question is present throughout the body of this essay, and the message you're trying to give is that Canada is lacking in a particular vision, and it's manifests itself in the sort of as you compared it to the Soviet era under Brezhnev, right? So like the people who are in a position to think outside the box, to like let's move people further north, let's expand the Arctic, let's take these risks. And in your essay, you outline how like those people are not stepping up to the plate and they're sort of abusing the system and parasitizing on themselves, right? They're like creating these bottlenecks. And there's this really interesting part where you're talking about um, some gentlemen who work for one of the railways and how someone's giving them a presentation about um, maybe Western economic development. Let's expand transportation infrastructure to meet Asian demand. Let's have railway extensions. And these guys didn't get it. They're just talking about, let's go vacation, let's go play golf. And all these guys who are sort of in control of the rail lines and could do something to expand Canada's supply chains and logistics, and then sort of economic opportunity that flows from that, like they just don't care. And like they just, maintain status quo. We're in charge. We're getting our bonuses. Just don't change anything, right? And I was sort of wondering if you could like sort of speak to that, and then maybe how that mentality applies to what we're seeing today with Trudeau and like Canada just going to shit on every single measure in the decade of his rule.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the article covers it like in more in depth than I can ever go in a conversation, which is like, so you have all these what I call them Brezhnevites, which are Brezhnevites are Soviet bureaucrats from the Brezhnev era, and the Brezhnev era was like kind of famously known for being extremely stagnant. So in the history of the Soviet Union is fairly short. It's from 1920 to 1990, so it's about 70 years. But if you compare, for example, the really awful but very dynamic Stalin period, where there was like they were building all these insane factories, these like huge steel mills, and there was a lot like investment going on, government directed investment. A lot of people died. Like it's a horrendous state, but like there's things happening. And then you compare it to like a much softer, much more relaxed Brezhnev period where like the repression has died down. Even like there's no stomach to do this kind of like Stalinian repression anymore. No one wants to send people to the camps because they don't really believe in their own project anymore. Like they're not even that ideal. Stalin was like a diehard believer in his own project and was willing to kill millions of people to do it. With Brezhnev, it's not clear whether he believes in the project that much anymore that he's willing to like send people to the camps anymore. They like exile people out of the country. You have people like Solzhenitsyn who are just like sent over, but there's no repression. But also at the same time, there's no economic dynamism anymore because they don't believe in their own project anymore. Like they're ideologically like gone, like it's disengaged. There's a term for this that comes, I don't remember the scholar, but he's a scholar of the Soviet Union called hypernormalization, where like people pretend to believe in it. There's still repression mechanisms around a certain ideological set of beliefs, but in reality, people just pretend to believe it. And at some point, people realize that everyone is pretending, but they keep pretending. So you end up with this Brezhnevite period. And I thought it was very similar to what was happening in Canada in 2019. I think it's a lot worse now. It's like noticeably worse. I think we're a little bit past the Brezhnev era. We're entering the Gorbachev collapse era a little more. Uh,
and
I
and
yeah,
and it's funny you bring up the collapse part, because I believe today we're recording this on Sunday, March 9th. I think today's the day that Trudeau like steps down. They're having their vote, or is it tomorrow, where the Liberal Party does their internal vote, and this sort of preordained, airdropped in globalist bankster,
mhm.
climate alarmism fuckwit Mark Carney is going to become our new prime minister, with almost nobody in Canada getting any say in it.
Absolutely. It's like the successions of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. We've decided our internal faction has come together and we've selected our own internal leader. And technically, and I have a wonderful Soviet story. So and this is one of the most shocking facts, and it'll resonate with a lot of Canadians today as Trudeau is stepping down. So, and Kotkin is one of the most famous American historians of the Soviet Union. He wrote a biography of Stalin. And I think in 1936, Stalin was passing a new constitution in which they were organizing what's called the People's Soviet. The People's Congress is basically a parliament for the Soviet Union. And they were so ideologically committed that they wanted to have elections by secret ballot. And Kotkin went through the documents of all these meetings that they were having with Stalin and his gang at the top during this period. And one of their main concerns is that we could lose the election. Okay. So while he's sending like millions of people to the camps, like absolutely cutting down the Soviet army, the Soviet intelligence networks, just gunning people down. He's like, we might lose the election. That's how much like ideologically weird it can get, right? You can have elections by secret ballot and absolute control over a state by a single party, right? So it's very similar now to what's happening, right? You still have the mechanisms of elections by secret ballot, but the entire structure is designed to keep one party in power and a certain set of people just always governing, right? People complain about China and Canada, but like China also has elections by secret ballot and they're legitimate. They're not competitive elections, but they're legitimate elections. They count the votes, right? And but it doesn't really matter in the end, does it?
No. Well, one of the factors that play here is, you mentioned the Freedom Convoy, something I supported
Mm,
and went. I went to
mm,
Ottawa. I supported it for the first
mm,
couple of days, then I had to go back to the States. I showed solidarity. Anyhow, uh, downstream of the convoy, I think Trudeau knew his days were numbered after his terrible handling of the convoy, right? Like they tried to seed the media with the narrative that they were Nazis and they're going to be doing January 6th North. And, the day they show up in Ottawa, Trudeau skips town, goes to hide at some dacha out in the outback of
mm,
Quebec, and I choose the word dacha very carefully here. Um, and after the Freedom Convoy, after he enacts the Emergencies Act, crushes it, everybody goes home or gets arrested. He I think he understood more about what was going on, I think, than the Conservative Party, right? Who were very slow to support the convoy and who were very tepid in their response to Trudeau. So Trudeau realizes that, oh man, I've annoyed a lot of people, and the Conservatives are going to figure this out, and they're going to confidence motion me out of Parliament. So he, within days of the Emergencies Act thing playing out, he makes this offer to Jagmeet Singh of the New Democratic Party. Let's do
mm,
this supply and confidence arrangement, and that way I'm not going to get confidence motioned out, right? And that arrangement has lasted to this day. The Conservatives have tabled I don't know how many confidence motions, and despite Jagmeet Singh going on TV saying I'm removing my support for Trudeau, then he votes to stop the next confidence motion, and he's like
mm.
he's just a psychotic psychological abuser in the same vein Trudeau is. This Jagmeet Singh character, Jimmy Dollywall is his real name actually, but um,
I
there's
call him Jagoff Singh, so
Jagoff
that's my
Singh.
logo.
Yeah. So Singh is in this position where his party is broke. My buddy Alex Zoltan broke this, and then the National Post turned it
Mm,
into an article a few months ago where it's been revealed that the NDP as a party, the federal New Democrats, are broke and they're in debt to the bankers for their last campaign. They don't have any money to run another one. And Singh was eligible for his pension once a certain amount of time went by. So the guy's basically looking out for his own pension and trying to make sure his party doesn't have to fight something that they can't fight because they have no money. So he's keeping Trudeau in power. But now this Carney guy is going to get airdropped in. And a few of us are starting to think that Singh is going to carry on this same arrangement with Carney, right? Where he's going to, say, look, let's continue the supply and confidence arrangement so that you don't get primary or confidenced out after only just being assigned this position because people are so angry. Like they know this, they know that the gig is up, but they keep they keep their boot on us. And another possibility that's been floated is that there's a I can't remember if it's the old BNA Act or Constitution or whatever predates the Charter of Rights and
mm,
Freedoms that elections can actually go to 5 years.
mhm.
They function as four, but if you call an emergency or have a vote on it in Parliament, you can extend it for another year. And I'm just wondering, if Jagoff Singh and this Mark Carney guy are hey, well, I'll just push the elections to 2026. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean they're very willing to do, I'm sure they're very willing to do that. And like I said, this is like an organized This is the organized faction, right? This is the inner party, so to say. I think one mistake that a lot of people make is to, I don't talk a lot about it in my articles, but I think it's one of the major dynamics and one of the major differences with the United States is we have a very deeply entrenched class structure in Canada in a way that like Americans don't understand. Like in America, if you're rich, you're at the top. It doesn't matter what you did. It doesn't matter what education you have. It doesn't matter what family you come from. Like if you have money, you're good, right? That's the measure of like of how society is organized as a hierarchy, right? In Canada, money doesn't even matter that much. It's really about pedigree. It's about upbringing. It's about what class you're born into. It's actually pretty hard to change social class in Canada.
Right.
Very
It's
difficult.
similar to the UK. It didn't change.
Yes, yes, that's right. So even if you're a very successful small business person that might have a couple $1 million, you're considered lower class than like some random lawyer who's like grinding it out at like 90K a year, right? That's a very strange country to have that sort of arrangement, right? And what conservatives don't understand is that they're not hated because for ideological reasons. Like the reason the CBC despises them and a portion of the country, even like regular working class people who lean a little left, hate them. We say a little left because we use ideological terms, but that's not correct. It's because they're Hicks, and like the entire structure is designed to like beat down on the Hicks. You know, like they present people like Andrew Scheer or Peter O'Toole as candidates who are like these randos from like Saskatchewan or from nowhere. They come with this like lower class, middle class manners. And you have Trudeau, who's like a prince, you know, he was he's the heir apparent who's like grown up around actors and like the elite of the world, and he has the pedigree. And they just get beat. They do just get whipped. Conservatism has been in Canada for the most part the whipping boy of the Liberal Party because the class politics are in place. And the Conservatives go back and they're like, oh, we need to be more principled in our conservative principles. It's like, no, this is the class system just beating you down because you're a hick. It hates you. Like, if you want to win, it's not so much about your ideological positions, but it's the fact that the system is designed to like press you as a class. Like you need to realize this. You know, it's quite brutal. And my reading, I'll give you the reading of the trucker convoy. I was overseas. I was in Brazil at the time, and I had a lot of friends who joined in. Of course, I have a lot of friends who are conservative leaning, a lot of working class friends, blue collar guys who got super excited. They joined in. They were going in, and they were like, "Oh, finally, Trudeau is afraid of us. He left the city." And I'm like, "You need to get the fuck out of there." Um, the reason a prince leaves the capital during a revolt is so he can gather his forces and come back and crush it. This has happened time and time again. Don't be fooled by the fact that you've scared him away. He's not scared. He's there to gather his forces, lick his wound, and come back and crush what is essentially peasant revolt, right? It wasn't super organized. It wasn't really like a movement. It wasn't a push to get like a political person and put a political leader in charge or anything like that. It was literally, we hate what you're doing to us. Please stop torturing us. Uh, what I would call essentially like peasant revolt, right? And that's what they think of you. They think that you're a peasant that needs to be put down because you're not organized, you have no movement, and you're a hick by nature, by your social class. So they can do whatever they want with you. And that's, I think, more accurate reading of what happened, and one that's like fairly neglected than like, oh, the leftist communists and so on are trying to beat us down, right? I think that's more accurate.
I want to share an observation, and I think that complements and supports
Yeah.
your view here. Is in the time ensuing since the Freedom Convoy,
Mhm.
let us look at the policy priorities of the Trudeau regime. Right, they
Mhm.
went after the internet. Right, the
Mhm.
C-18. There was a couple of bills to try and control the internet and to control the flow of information because, as you put it, this peasant revolt. One of the reasons the Freedom Convoy was so popular is that it took off on social media. Right, the
Mhm.
Freedom Convoy was a legitimately, spontaneously organized and
Yes.
decentralized thing. It had
Yes.
no central leadership.
Yes.
Tamara Lich and Chris Barber didn't become faces of it and like quote unquote leaders until they got to Ottawa and
Mm.
they sort of had to like consolidate and figure
Mhm.
something out when they got there. But as the Freedom Convoy came to Ottawa, it was totally decentralized. people just did their own thing. They saw things happening on TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter, on the news, whatever, and they're like, "Damn, let's get in on this." And so, Trudeau's not stupid. Like, he's a conniving son of a bitch, and
Hmm.
that's why a couple of their primary policy focuses since then has been to try and control the internet. And then there's this like Bill C-63 thing, whatever. It died when he prorogued Parliament, but
Hmm.
they were basically trying to like throw you in jail for wrongthink. Like, if they had determined, some committee of unelected
Hmm.
bureaucrats had determined that you had, um, you know, advocated for genocide. What does that mean? You said some mean, hateful things. They could put you in jail for life, right? Like, it's clear that this prince was trying to destroy the tools of the peasants, which is to say, social media.
Yeah, any conduit for peasants having another little party out in the middle of Ottawa. How dare they invade our beautiful capital from whatever from their hick little town? It's the level of class contempt is so incredible, and what really shocks me is that the conservatives don't see it, and they play into the stereotype of like the clueless hick, whereas like they're literally being spit on over and over again. Um,
So
and
you
one,
can I ask you a question real quick? So you said
yeah,
they're clueless and they don't get it.
yeah.
One of the things people in Canada right now, like the people watching the politics and
Mm,
wanting Trudeau gone and wanting an alternative,
mm,
are witnessing is this like drop. So Pierre Poilievre has been trying to do like before Trudeau prorogued Parliament and announced he was
mhm,
leaving. Poilievre was like beating them in the polls. Every poll showed that if there was an election today, the Conservatives would win in a landslide. And now they're basically neck and neck. The Conservatives have lost their lead in the polls, if they're to be believed. That's another question.
mhm.
But a criticism I think is correct is that Poilievre doesn't know what time it is, right? He just keeps repeating this carbon tax election, absolutely won't touch a whole number of issues, including immigration, including like, there's almost 5 million people in Canada on various temporary visas, which is more than 10% of the population.
Mhm.
Um, the sclerosis of the economy. When Trump started doing this annexation 51st state stuff, he sort of like, fell in line and didn't get it that like Trump probably doesn't care about the tariffs too much. It's about other things, you know? And Poilievre and the Conservative Party, time and time again, just show that like they are not legitimate opposition. Like they don't get it. Like, do you have some insight into what's going on with these
Yeah, yeah.
guys?
I think it's again the hick thing. Uh, yeah, I love when you look at like if you compare, you like look very closely at how Mark Carney speaks and how Pierre Poilievre speaks, right? And he's trying to do this like Western populism thing. He's of course Franco-Sasquatch. He's a francophone from Saskatchewan, and he's trying to like channel this like Western resentment, which is of course like the industrial classes, the people who are actually doing work, as opposed to like people sitting on their asses in Toronto collecting the fat checks, right? Um, and his messaging is like that: cut the carbon tax, let's build again. Like it's a very like populist working class message. And look at how Carney speaks. He talks like a technocrat. He talks like a bureaucrat. He's like, we will take these specific measures. He speaks very calmly, and that's actually one of the reasons why it cratered. It's not just why Poilievre's support cratered. Is because people hated Trudeau, but now they're allowed once again. They're given an opportunity through the various state medias, the CBC or whatever, to again beat on the hick. And a lot of people join in on this. It's not just like the elites who are doing this. There's a lot of people in Canada who, because they've grown up and been conditioned in a class structure, they really cannot imagine that some hick from Saskatchewan could ever make the decisions for them. They rather have the banker that would ruin their lives, that would destroy their livelihood, than ever accept that a hick could ever rule over them. Like it's very psychological in that sense. And this is like the structure of the country and how the politics in the country work. So and Polyev is going to struggle again, right? It's not just about the issues that you bring, it's who you are. It's very important, right? What kind of people are carrying your message?
Right. And that gets to another quote I have written down here um, from your late Soviet pessimism article.
Mm,
And I believe one of your friends brought in this term thumos, which is to say
yes.
spirit,
Hmm.
and how the sort of thumos of Canada is contained. And then we're talking about this Carney character who, has been referenced by, the American Senate, and his Carney's like one of these climate alarmist people, right? He wants to reshape society in the same way as, like, Klaus Schwab, Great Reset, which is not a it's not a friggin' conspiracy theory, guys. It's an actual book. The guy wrote it. There's all these people out there that are laundering their money through NGOs and foundations, and
Hmm.
they're,
Yes,
they're they are
yes.
trying to influence world governance without having any political accountability, without any contestation from the polity, which is to say the Hicks. Um,
Hmm. That's right.
and I kind of wrote this little throwaway quote here based on your
Hmm.
friend in this article. Tell me if I'm wrong. Um, there's not enough climate change on Earth to deal with the deep permafrost where Canada's thumos is trapped.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the more climate alarmism we have, the worse it's going to get, right? Um, Canada is very weird because it has some very talented people. It has some very skilled people. And I've seen it because I'm a Canadian who's been abroad. But if you go and look at other Canadians who've been abroad, they become like extremely successful. Elon Musk is a very good example of this, someone who's kind of gone through the Canadian system. And then as soon as he's landed on foreign soil, he just took off, right? Um, and we need to be able to do that at home again, right? And that's very important. But we have it in us, right? It's pretty frozen. Um, and what the job of these Brezhnevites, these Carneites, or whatever you want to call them, is like to beat you down, to keep you under submission, essentially. And it's a submission you participate in and you collaborate in, right? When I was talking about all these people who don't want some guy from Saskatchewan to rule over them because he's a hick, that's a self-learned kind of helplessness. It's like a ingrained class muscle that just activates. And people are not even aware of it because when our media doesn't talk about it, or just some people some political scientists, some obscure academics who talked about it in the 60s and the 70s, but it's not out there. We talk about it in terms of left and right, and that's there to confuse people, to stop them from seeing that like you're actually being spit on and you're the architect of your own misfortune. The thing is, like this, the Trudeau government or the oligarchy or anything is barely holding on to power. Like they've lost control completely. It's gone sideways. Um, and it's very brittle. They've inflicted this because they're completely incompetent and stupid. Like, let's be honest as well, right? They can be very conniving. They can pull off these like put downs of the truckers and so on. But they're not that intelligent. They're not smart enough to run the country.
Okay,
So,
speaking of those people, there's a term
mhm,
that you and I and a few others have thrown around a lot, called the Laurentian elite.
mhm.
And this group of people are, uh, I reference them as the people whom, Trudeau's their guy. He is their political guy. The Liberal Party of Canada is the political arm of this Laurentian elite. Could you expand for my listeners on exactly what that Laurentian elite is, who they are, what they own, and what function they serve in the management of Canada?
Sure. After the 40s, after the war ended and the British Empire started going into decline, the kinds of elites that we had, like the MacDonald elites and so on, even before that, there's a process that started. The very like pro-British, British North America elites that we had are just not sustainable because there was no British Empire anymore. So to keep the country together, to have like some semblance of a nation or national project, the Laurentian elite proposed this, like, the CBC, bilingualism, brutalist architecture, uh, government employments, the social welfare state. Um, it's a kind of national project. The Laurentian elite are 500 families who sit at the top of these institutions. And it don't and people make the mistake of thinking this is Parliament and the Liberal Party. It's not. It's the heads of the banks, the heads of the power corporations, the variety of NGOs and charities that are run that receive money and funding. It's portions of the oligarchy as well, like the Saputos, the Desmarais. These are based in Ontario and Quebec, right? Um, who are beneficiaries of like government regulations. For example, why do you think there's such a barrier to dairy in Canada for foreign dairy to be sold? It's because the Saputo family is one of the oligarchic families in Canada. They're I think the largest dairy producer either in North America or in the world. I can't remember which. And they're completely protected by government measures, right? So the Laurentian elite is this elite that controls a lot of the major financial, commercial, industrial, media, and political institutions in the country. And there's one line that I really liked, and I enjoyed putting in the article as I wrote, Canada is 500 families and everyone else is a foreigner. And I think that captures the feeling very much, right?
Right. Well, I want to, I'm going to criticize myself here a little bit. I harp on, I don't want to like try and demean myself or like do the like, uh, bad modesty thing here or fake modesty, but like I'm literally a trucker and my family are recent arrivals to Canada. My mother was born in Scotland. My dad was born in Canada, but like his father was from Ireland. His mother was Italian. So, my claims to any rooting in Canada are not that deep as like other people, especially people I talk to online. There's a great account. There's this guy, I don't even know what his real name is. Forty Sacks. He's just this young dude and he's bilingual and he completely understands the history of Canada like way back to the 17th century, the seigneurial system in Quebec, and he understands the Maritimers and the Acadians and like the sort of ethnos, like the real people that started what Canada is. And I got in the grand scheme of things, I got here yesterday, and I don't even live there anymore. These concerns about the Laurentian elite and stuff, and then I talk about like even more recent immigrants, right? So I'm a trucker and I see the replacement of the Canadian trucking industry by people from India that got here yesterday. And there's these systems in place where, out in British Columbia and in Ontario, they have
Mhm.
captured the issue of work visas through corruption, through the people who issue labor market impact assessments, the temporary foreign worker program. They've convinced the government that there's a shortage of truck drivers, which is totally untrue. There's tons of us around. We won't work for nothing. So they bring in these guys from India and they work for nothing. And what do? They drive through Northern Ontario and get in head on collisions with each other and cars and kill people left, right, and center. The Humboldt tragedy in Saskatchewan a few years ago. And the same thing's happening in the United States. And I'm trying to like connect the dots here. And you're saying that like these 500 families run the show and the rest of us are immigrants. Like, as much as I want to fight against the forces that are making me compete against these guys that do my
Mhm.
job, but much worse, but for much cheaper, and are causing an actual material problem, like I get it that there's these forces at work that are bringing these people here. Am I
Yeah.
supposed to align with those same guys, or should I like make it a singular channel to fight the 500 families? Like, do you understand the question?
Yes, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I think it's going to be uh, like at the moment is so chaotic that it's very hard to determine. Uh, First, historically, this has always happened, the sort of thing that we talk about, like bringing these foreigners, because this has been the model for Canadian governance since like the 17th century. It's like, well, we have an elite. The elite runs the place. They own the things, and if they need foreign labor to come in and do things or break something, they'll do it. Uh, we can start with like the Acadians, right? The Acadians were in Nova Scotia and so on. So what happens? The British deported them and brought in British immigrants. Same thing happened in Quebec. They attempted to completely ethnically cleanse the French by bringing in immigrants from Britain. Same thing happened in the West, where they brought in Central European Poles, Ukrainians, and so on, so they could crush whatever hold the Métis or the native indigenous people had. So this is a playbook that's happened before. It's not like people think of it as like a recent World Economic Forum weird one world government conspiracy. It's not like this is literally how this country was built. So should you align with the so-called scabs? No, right? But you also shouldn't let, I think, like as a regular person, like allow yourself to be dispossessed of your livelihood. Or if your world is going to shit, why wouldn't you fight back? Why wouldn't you say, you know what? It's not that we're the foreigners, it's actually you guys are morons and you shouldn't be where you are and you're there because for inertial reasons. And Trump has done this south of the border, right? He's shown how that's done. Trump is also considered a hick because he's kind of a tacky New Yorker. He doesn't understand like the upper class proprieties of American governance. He's not the Harvard guys. He's not, a Harvard law guy or anything. He's like some random businessman. But guess what? If you're more energetic, you win. And I think the point needs to be made to break kind of this like class frozenness that we have that Chinese have this concept, the mandate of heaven. So the mandate of heaven is like whoever is in government deserves to govern, right? So if you can grab power for yourself, it means you deserve it. It means heaven is behind you, supporting you, and so on. So people need to think of it in this way, which is like you can do things, you can organize to grab and take power, and you shouldn't think of yourself as a serf having to suffer um, the kinds of like outrageous behavior of a decadent elite. You don't have to. You can change the narrative, you can change the vision for yourself. And Canada has plenty to bank on. Like who built this country? It was like I mentioned a few things, like the pioneer and the settlers in the prairies, the miners in the Yukon, the sailors of the Atlantic, right? You have all these like archetypes or historical figures or historical like types that you can draw on even from within the country that's like well rooted here, whether you're a recent immigrant. What I mean recent, I mean like assimilated, let's say, or like your family's been here for 300 years. You have things to bank on. There's ammunition that's available to you to kind of get out of like being the whipping boys of like this decadent elite, right? You don't have to suffer it. Human dignity, I think, is pretty important, and like why would you allow yourself or your families or your livelihood to be like broken apart in front of you, right? It's unjust. I'm sorry. It's how it is.
Right. Wow, that was quite a statement, sir. I have to print
Yeah.
that out and put it up on my wall. Well, you mean and you say you can just do things, and I like to fancy myself as a bit of a proponent of that. I just started this podcast. I just started writing, and some people are listening to me about this stuff. I wonder how long till I get crushed. But anyhow, so the Arctic. I want to get back to that. So we're talking about the past and the history of this like ruling elite that's got its grip on Canada. And in your most recent article at IM 1776, what was it called?
Gambit. Yeah.
The Arctic Gambit. So you're looking to the future, which people should do. You got to kind of like measure that against sort of reality and without getting into too much fantasy. But in that article, you were very careful about the sort of practical realities and what's actually going on there up there, insofar as the Russians have got all these ports along the Arctic, and people have to stop thinking about the world in this two-dimensional flat map.
Mm-hmm.
We have to think about it. Take globalism and actually think about it that way. Here we have this globe, right? And if you position it this way, oh wow, it's actually a whole lot closer to get to Europe going through the Arctic. And logistics and supply chains do not depend on fantasy, they depend on material reality. And if it's thousands of miles closer to ship stuff and cheaper, they're going to go that way. And so we have this issue with the Arctic, right? and all of this opportunity with the Arctic. And I remember, and I made a tweet about this. I think you saw where when I was younger, 20 years ago, 18 years
Mm-hmm.
ago, I'm up on the ice. I'm working for this trucking
Mm-hmm.
company in Yellowknife. I'm running up to the diamond mines in the Northwest Territories. And in our company's office, and sort of, they had like a little camp for the drivers. You get something to eat and a shower and stuff. They were a pretty good company before they got sold off to fuckheads, but whatever. That's another story. Um, they had this map, and it was a mining resources map of the Canadian Arctic, Northwest Territories, sort of west, Nunavut, the islands,
Mm-hmm.
Yukon, northern Alaska, and there's a place called Bathurst Inlet. It's a proposed deep water port, and a lot of the diamond mining companies were like, "We are spending a ton of money trucking all this stuff, right?" Like by the time a liter of diesel fuel gets from the refinery in Edmonton, drives 1,000 miles to Yellowknife, goes into
Mm-hmm.
storage, you wait for winter, then it drives the next couple hundred miles to the mine on the ice road, it's no longer $1.50 or $2 a liter. It's $8 a liter or $10 a liter
Mm-hmm.
because of the cost of transportation. So they're looking up there and they're going, wow, maybe we should build this port in Bathurst Inlet and then truck it from the south. We'll build an all weather road to get to at least Contueto Lake. And then, even if we have to wait till the winter for all those roads to freeze, from coming from the north, your winter season can start earlier and go longer. You can have less trucks. It's
Mm-hmm.
getting boated to Bathurst Inlet. The transloading costs are less. We can do this thing in the Arctic. And I remember being a young guy up there. I'm like 26, 27 years old. I'm like, damn, these guys I drive fuel for, they've got a road construction company as part of their group of companies. I could get a job with them and go build this road. Like
Mm-hmm.
I could be part of this development of like my nation's thing in the Arctic and do this cool stuff. And then the Bathurst Inlet project never went anywhere. And now here we are 20 years later, and I don't hear anything from the government, the media, nothing about doing anything with the Arctic. And so I read your article and I have all these like muscle memories of living in Yellowknife. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
damn, man, like whatever happened to the vision about up there? Right. So lay out why you wrote this article and the sort of key points we need to take away from Canada and the United States should be developing the Arctic, and that should be a bigger component of our, national conversation.
Yeah, one thing that we should look about is like as the country as it currently is, I don't think it's sustainable. You have like these big fractures with Quebec and Alberta, and there's nothing really unifying this thing. And as soon as it's going to get pushed a little bit, it might like shatter into pieces. So we need to do, if this country is ever going to survive in any form, it needs like something to do. It needs something that unifies it around it. And the Arctic is a very good project because it's so radically different from what's been done before. So we kind of break the hold of like the structure of the country and start being a real one for once. Um, the other thing is like, of course, like with the melting of the ice caps, you have warmer seasons up there. You can actually ship. Like before 2007, I think you couldn't even like actually do the Northwest route. No, you actually can for like portions of the year. Um, Also, it's exactly what you mentioned. Like you yourself, as a young person, like working up there, uh, were like excited by something that you could build and call your own. Like you want to do something with your existence, right? You have a lot of young people today who have just no direction. What they're trying to do is like get a degree and get like a somewhat okay paying job and kind of weather it out. Um, but in order to like have self-respect, in order to grow as a person, in order to grow as a community, in order to grow as a country, people need to be doing shit. Like this is not optional. Um, it's you either suffocate and die or you grow, right? And like the Arctic becomes the space which like all the problems can kind of be solved. If you can solve the environmental regulation versus overregulation problem, you can do it in the Arctic. It's fantastic. We're really good at controlling and managing large expenses, particularly. So let's be the best at that. Um, let's develop our natural resources, right? We're very good at that. We've always been a resource-rich country. So let's do the things we're really good at. We have also the planning and the strategy side. So we've always had very smart people in Canada who've kind of like saved the country at the nick of time. And they're there. They're all thinking about the Arctic at the moment. Um, and then there's also the US-Canada relationship, which is super important, which is why should Canada exist? Like the British Empire is gone. It's like this weird, socially liberal, spendthrift, useless country that's really not that economically competent. It's militarily useless. It's actually a liability, and it's in the northern expenses in the Arctic for the US, which they would have to shore up militarily. And right now we're in a trade war with them where the mindset coming from both sides, right? Even Doug Ford, from who's a conservative figure, the way he talks about the relationship and the way Trump talks about the relationship is always like this win lose. We're gonna win, you're gonna lose, or if you win, we're gonna lose. It's always like this win lose conversation. And I wanted to write this article exactly at this moment because the Arctic becomes a space where the US Canada can both win, right? So if Canada is competent and powerful and has an actual navy and can ensure its security in the Arctic, that becomes a security shield for the US. So they won't have to worry about the Arctic. They won't have to worry about Russian and Chinese incursions or I mean they've been very aggressive up there as well. So
No,
if
it's
Ca
being able to say as a friend, right?
yeah.
We got this, homie. We got it.
Yeah,
You can
we're
trust
gonna
us.
do you a solid one here, and you won't have to worry up here. We'll take care of this,
Right.
right?
If only. If only.
If only, right? So suddenly it becomes a win-win conversation, right? It's like, look, we'll exploit. We need your capital, we need your expertise, we need American engineers, we need your guys to come in and help us build it. You're going to make a lot of money from doing this. We're all both going to get extremely rich. You'll get access to all the resources that you need to reindustrialize back home. You'll get primary access. Even give you like we'll give you very competitive prices. We'll give you discount prices on the minerals if you invest and help us build it. Uh, we'll have a great relationship. You'll be protected from the north. We can tie up the Chinese and the Russians up there militarily as well. We'll have a very prosperous North American bloc. And we can do this together, right? Suddenly the conversation isn't about like who wins the tariff war. You have something more productive. You actually have a vision for how the country Canada is supposed to evolve, but also the Canada-US relationship can evolve. Because the absence of it, the other flip side, which is like if we don't do this, it's pretty catastrophic if you think about it. People are like getting super hyped up about Canada getting annexed, but the United States doesn't have the willpower, the political capital, or like the understanding to absorb Canada. Like this isn't like East Germany getting absorbed into West Germany. We're like a continental sized country with like extremely idiosyncratic, extremely heterogeneous. It's going to be very difficult to absorb Canada, like from a technical just standpoint. So,
Right.
uh,
I've been thinking about what to do about this problem, the 51st state annexation thing. Um, because I'm very sympathetic to the arguments of people like my online friend here or
yes,
Fortisax that,
yeah,
Canada, despite the horrendous and not very useful immigration policies of Trudeau and the gang, there's still a significant majority of like what you might call a Canadian ethnos,
mhm,
French and Anglophones.
yes,
I'm a little less comfy with this, veneration of king and God and country and
hmm
the sort of George Grant nationalism.
hmm
Um, I get it. I get it that Canada should be a thing. Does it need to continue being a thing under the English crown? Do we need to continue having King Charles III and this fucking Privy Council bunch of retards, getting in the way of everything, and then like the Laurentian elite who keep them there? I'm very, I like your vision, but again, as you say, the Americans can't, like, we're already kind of like a vassal state or a satrapy of the United
hmm
States. But as you mentioned, and for reasons I think are well argued, I don't think they can run it themselves. And
no,
but we can't either under the current management, right?
that's right.
So I've made jokes about this online about regime change, but I don't think they're really jokes, right? Like, Canada cannot move forward with the people in charge. as you laid out in the late Soviet pessimism thing, all they do is set up roadblocks to innovation, to wealth
That's right.
creation, to
That's right.
engaging in the kind of like mutually beneficial, big project, big thinking stuff like you outlined in your article about the Arctic. And I keep coming back to this idea, like Canada Canadians, unfortunately, we just cannot get rid of these people. And then, when Trudeau is and the Liberals are weak, they make deals with like other assholes like Jimmy Dollywall, aka Jagmeet Singh, or the Bloc Québécois, and nothing happens. It's just another roadblock, right? Like I don't want Canada to be part of the United States. It's two separate things, and it should remain that way to a point. And so, I say this sort of jokingly, but sort of not. It's time to clean house. And like, if Donald Trump was serious, um, you mentioned the 500 families. Send the 10th Mountain Division. Send a few Navy SEAL teams. Go to Ottawa with a couple of 747s. Toronto, Montreal. Round these people up because we can just do things. Send them to Guantanamo Bay and do the Soviet stuff, do the Stalin thing. You guys are preventing the Soviet state from moving forward, and you're going to
Mm.
spend 10 years here thinking about it, and then we'll let you out. And
Maybe,
I
maybe maybe we should exile them to the Arctic.
something, yeah. Well, there's a number there's a number of people that deserve that, but I don't think the
Yeah.
Inuit deserve it. The Inuit have been there for 40,000 years. Why would they? Why would we send them more useless white people?
We'll
Um,
we'll build it. We'll build separate settlements so they don't mix and they
Right,
can't get up.
something, but like I'm serious about this. Like, Trump should stop with the 51st state stuff. Like, he doesn't get what you're saying. He doesn't understand it, but he is still speaking to a problem that this cooperation, this wealth creation project of like working on the Arctic is a viable thing we could do, but we have to get the idiots out of our way who are stopping it from happening. Like, regime change. Let's do it, and you could do it peacefully. Most Canadians, like all the people that you're talking about, like the 51st state, the Hicks, the Saskatchewan, Alberta people who are like, oh, we should join America. We're so tired of Trudeau. Okay, we don't need to like join America. We can join hands with them as brothers to take out these fucking swine in Ottawa and Montreal that are ruining everything. And then let's work together to develop the Arctic and like make something new and better and remain Canada, and the United States can remain the United States. Like, what do you say to that?
Well, yeah. I mean, that would be great if we could do it on such like a fast timeline. Um, I just want to make a note to the people who are on the pro annexation side. Like, I would benefit from annexation, incredible. Like, it would just be great for me. I'm a computer scientist. I would just get a job that pays 3 times more if we get absorbed in the US. I would just go work down south. So personally, my situation would improve significantly. Um, but I just look at the realities of what it is. It's like if the United States cannot like physically absorb, annexation is not on the table because Canada is like built in such a very specific, weird way um, that it makes it impossible. I can give you a couple examples, like the Quebec language laws that Quebec has to protect, like its French ethnic composition, its French cultural majority. That would be illegal under the First Amendment of the United States. What are you going to do? You're going to strike down Quebec's French language laws? They're going to throw a fit over it, like, and then I don't know, like, it's not going to work. Like this country is designed in a very specific way. You have also the way that the railways are built, the way that you have two judicial systems. So it's too complicated for the United States to absorb. They can do it if they had like the will to do it, but they don't. They don't understand what it means to absorb like a country the size of Canada, right? Um, so what you're left is like, if annexation is not on the table, then you either have to be unified as a country, continue have something that resembles a functional state, which is the what I was talking about, the Arctic situation, and actually going and building a new state that's not British North America, or you're gonna fall into and collapse into a couple pieces. So Alberta gets out hoping to become a U.S. state, but they're like, you know what? I don't care. We're too down bad here. I hate this confederation thing, so I'm out. Alberta's out. Quebec might go out. So you start collapsing the way the Soviet Union collapsed. And what's going to happen is that the people in Alberta were hoping to become a US state, but what they end up more is like something like Estonia, right? Just a small country that's totally irrelevant. It's a rump state. So that possibility needs to be like taken very seriously, that the country could actually just collapse and you won't end up living in the United States, enjoying the US dollar, having all these wonderful like US salaries. What you'll end up with would be like Estonia in 1991. Like, do you want that? No. Like, do you need to take this a little more seriously is the message I'm trying to get out to people, which is there's a real possibility of that happening. There's a real possibility that in a couple of years, you wake up one morning and it's Estonia in 1991. Like, be very careful what's going on here. This is not a joke. People's lives are like livelihoods and futures are on the end of it, right? Um, Now, for the regime change, yes, regime change can be done and it should be done because there's no other solution. It's either Estonia or we get rid of these idiots. And I think more people need to start to realize that. The thing is, we don't need, I don't think Trump has the willpower or it would even like fly to send like, I don't know, some special ops troop to pick out the 500 Laurentian families. There's something more easy that can be done, which is if you look at the collapse of regimes typically collapse into something, right? East Germany collapsed into West Germany. So if you want this regime change, if you want this collapse of the Laurentian elite, they're not even that like energetic or that like hyped up about staying in power. They're there by inertia. They're there because they were either born into it or like they believe that they're supposed to be there. They don't really believe in it. It's like I said in my article, a regime without real loyalists. There's so much infighting even within their own rank. Christopher Freeland with Mark Carney. They have no unified vision. They've completely screwed up the future of the country, and they're aware of it. They know they did a horrendous job of it anyways, but they're going to stay there because they believe Hicks should not be in power. So you need to give this regime something to collapse into. And so it's surprisingly like easy to do things, right? I won't go into details. I'm not going to name the names, but for example, the recent electoral like surge of the BC cons, for example. Uh, it's not all Hicks. There's a very interesting thing that's happened, particularly with my generation, which is a lot of like the would-be managerial class, like the UBC, University of Toronto class kids, who are like grounded, rooted Canadians and so on. Um, they graduated and one day they woke up and exactly like what you said had happened to the trucking industry. The Laurentian elite had acquired a new managerial subservient. Uh, uh, they've used immigration to kind of create a new managerial elite that's more subservient, less capable. And what's happened is a lot of the guys from my generation who were supposed to be managerial professional class have essentially defected to the Hicks. So now what you end up with is you have people who were supposed to run the state who are suddenly in opposition to the state. And like I said, I won't name specific name, but the BC Con victory in not victory, but like this huge electoral surge was particularly engineered by this alliance of the Hicks and the would-be managerial elite that's like completely spurned and they're fucking pissed off and they really want they're very baying for blood now.
I would be
Um,
remiss if I didn't put a little asterisk on this surge with the British
mm,
Columbia Conservatives. There's been a lot of talk about how the BC NDP they skated just back into power, but only just, and maybe there was some dodgy business going on there. And something I think is interesting too, as a sidebar here, is the premier of British Columbia, this communist fucktard named David
yeah,
Eby, doing his social signaling against Trump, has floated this idea of taxing American trucks transiting through British Columbia to get to
so nuts.
Alaska, which is one, illegal according to the treaty that Canada and the United States signed about the construction of the Alcan Highway,
Mm,
the Alaska Highway that goes through
mm,
BC and the Yukon. So they're going against a treaty that's 80 years old now, and it's basically punishing a tiny percentage of the shipping that goes to Alaska. 99% of the material goods that go in and out of Alaska from the United States go by boat. The trucking is only a small component of that. So literally, and this talks to the Canadian elite in how they want to punish, the Hicks. They want to do this like social signaling thing where we're going to punish these American hicks going back through Alaska, but it's only it doesn't it's signaling that doesn't mean anything because it's only a tiny fraction of the actual stuff. And B, you're shooting yourselves in the foot by going against a contract your own government signed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on the surge, I'm going to make a point that a lot of conservatives need to hear because they haven't figured this out. They think we live in a democracy. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. Okay. People need to understand that. No, I'm not kidding. You people need to take this to heart. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. Right? If your livelihood and the future of your family is at stake and you're like, you want to play by the rules, fuck you. You should go home. Right? You're not ready for this. Um, so yeah, but things can be done and things can be moved pretty peacefully. It just people need to understand how to operate. Like I've been in the private sector all my life. I haven't had a government job. I've worked in some pretty frontier cowboy capitalism places. Um, and one thing you learn is like if you need to operate, you need to get serious. So what happens with people when they get elected or when they're starting to organize a counter movement, they're like, well, I want to voice my opinions. Well, I want to say what I want to say. I have a different opinion from you, so I'm going to go do my own thing. It's like, no, you guys need to like fall into an organized outfit the way that the elite does, somewhat. You need, in fact, to be way more organized than the Laurentian elite. You need to fall more in line. You need to collaborate more, and you can take power. And I mean this, like, you can start very small. Like if you have a couple guys in your small town, and guess what? Your municipal government is determined by like, I don't know, like 4 votes or 10 votes. Like that's how people win municipal elections in most of Canada. It comes down to a couple hundred votes, and even in the big cities. So if you can swing a couple hundred votes, you can put your guy in the municipal council. Guess what? You can probably do that at the provincial riding level as well. Guess what? You can also probably do that at the federal level. So if you get a little more organized, just slightly, like we're not saying you need to like engage in regime change. Like, people go from 0 to 100 very quickly. Uh, People want to like overthrow the government or whatever, but it's like you're not even ready to win elections. How you can't even win local election. Like how are you going to overthrow and run a country, right? You need to be so organized. This thing, this like fucked up on not working thing, needs to collapse into you because you're the more organized, more energetic, more visionary section of society, and they're like gone, like they have nothing to stand for. Right. That's what happened to the Soviet Union. They were like, well, this Stalin, this like Soviet thing is not like that interesting anymore. It's not energetic. It's tired. What do we want? We want capitalism. We want liberal democracy. That's what's energetic. There were people who were very, of course, like very courageous at that moment. People stood up. Orban in Hungary, for example, is a very good example of that. He was an anti-communist leader in the 80s. He was very courageous, but he was they were so organized that they had given something for the Hungarian socialist government to collapse into. And that needs to happen. Like people are like fantasizing about regime change or they're fantasizing about annexation. They can't even get their own backyards organized. They can't even win local elections that you can win by a couple hundred votes. So go out and staff the municipal governments with your guys. Get organized in your own communities. And guess what? Like you also have, like I said, a lot of guys from the would-be managerial elite. These are like trained, these are guys who were trained from birth to basically run Canada for the Laurentian elite to hold it together. They know exactly how it works, and they're on your side, right? So if you're able to get organized at your local community level, what you'll find is at the provincial level, if not in the small towns, but at least in the big cities, there'll be a lot of these guys who'll come down, and guess what? They'll help you cut up the bureaucracy that's holding back your small businesses, that's holding back your ability to earn a living. They'll rip it to pieces for you. They'll come in and tell you exactly how to do it, right? It's a little bit of organization, it's a little bit of coordination, but it's entirely possible. And there's no need to like ask the US government to invade Canada to pull that off, right?
Right. Sort of a new variation of think global, act local. Yeah, take advantage of the guys that the elite are trying to replace and use them for your team.
Yeah, they're on your side. These people hate the regime. They're they're they've what I like I said, they're defected to the Hicks. They're like on your side now. They're your guys. You can trust them. Uh, they've also been hurt by all the policies that you've been hurt by. The reason you can't start your small business is also the reason why they can't start their businesses. They also hate the cost of living has ballooned the same way yours has. They also hate that their jobs have been taken away, that their career prospects suck. Right? I talk about it in the first article. Like the guy, my friend T, who I mentioned in the article, is one of those kids. Super bright kid, went to top schools, economics graduate, and just like he's seen his career prospect crater. And guess what? Now he hates it. He's on your side and he's there to like he's ready to break it down.
One of the interesting things you mentioned about T is that he's the son of a immigrant family from
Hmm.
Iran,
Hmm.
and he's looking at what's going on in Iran, and there are people in Iran who are moving up the social economic ladder much faster than him. And like if setting aside the politics, a lot of people like to smack Iran
Mm.
because of the mullahs and the conflict with
Mm.
Israel and all this geopolitics stuff. But like internally within Iran, it seems like there's more upward social and class mobility there than there is in Canada right now.
At least that's the impression I get from my conversation. There's a lot of Iranians in Vancouver, so I get to talk to with them a lot, and I get a little deep about with how they feel back home. Some people are like love Iran and they like spending time in Canada, but they would prefer to be back home, or they're here to study and they're ready to go back, right? So a lot of people have very good things to say about Iran, but I think it's not just limited to Iran. It's a lot of countries, like take the Chinese, right? If the Chinese have a choice, if they're really doing well at home, they wouldn't come here. Why would they come to a country that's completely stagnant, completely foreign culture, completely alien, where they're a racial, ethnic minority, linguistic minority? No one wants to like be that. So uh, if anyone has a choice, if anyone's doing really well, they would just go stay in China or go back to China, and you see that a lot, right? People go back, pack up, and go home. A lot of Canadians go to America. It's the same movement. It's like, well, everyone is just passing us by, right? We used to be a place that people would love to immigrate to, like they would kill themselves to get here. Now, not so much. We were getting like basically bottom of the barrel immigration in the last several years, right? We're no longer the location of choice, right?
Yeah, well, the abuse of all these programs, and I mean Trudeau, I think to his credit, was starting to realize it was becoming a political liability for him. In November, they
Hmm.
announced they were going to start clamping down on some of this stuff. Whether that clamping down takes place and what that looks like, that's another story. And who
Yeah,
knows?
yeah, we don't know. We don't
Yeah,
know how it's going to work out, right? They can say it and then not do it.
yeah,
They don't even
exactly.
know how many people are in the country. Like, do you trust these people to actually like have a put a clamp on the immigration? They can't even keep track of the people coming in. Like, come on, let's be
Yeah.
serious here.
I remember when I was younger and I was a little bit more like, I didn't know so much and I was more in sway to the CBC Canadian propaganda and the end of history neoliberal project and immigration is great and all these people from around the world, it's awesome. Everything's awesome. And I would meet people from the Netherlands who I would have these weird conversations with because I grew up in this like small town in Niagara, kind of close to Niagara Falls. And there was a lot of Dutch migration there after World War II because there was good farmland there and the Dutch are great farmers. But they also, some of the people from certain provinces of the Netherlands have these sort of like they're very tight knit communities. They have what might be called fundamentalist religious viewpoints. They started their own schools. They were somewhat insular, and I had this like antagonistic relationship with some of those people as I was growing up because I'm not Dutch. I didn't grow up in a religious home. Anyway, I would meet people from the Netherlands when I was traveling as a young man, and they would tell me about like you know the immigration situation in the Netherlands, and they're like, you know, Netherlands is a very tiny country, but our leadership just keeps bringing these people here. Like, where are they going to live? And at the same time as the freedom convoy happening, the Dutch farmers rose up, and we find out that like the Dutch government is trying to seize land from the farmers and build apartment buildings and like import more people from North Africa and the Middle East. And to what end? Like, what is the end goal here when when the people who run your country consider it as nothing more than a work camp or economic zone that you can just like move all this human resources slurry through it? And then the people who are from there and even the immigrants they're trying to attract look at it and say, you guys have turned this place into a fucking dump and we don't even want to
Yes.
move there.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
when do the people who are orchestrating this start to realize that their plan is not working?
Well, I
Can
think they
can
realize
can
that they just
can
don't
they, or are
care.
they too blind? Like, are they too
No, no,
blind? Do they not care? Like, what's going on?
I think they see that their plan isn't working, but they're all out of ideas. I mean, these are people who outsource their thinking to like fucking McKinsey. They bring in consultants from McKinsey to tell them everything they already know. That actually, if you bring in a little more immigrants, you're going to get a little more GDP, and the country won't go into a formal recession, even though we're in a GDP per capita recession, right? Anyways, it's a lot of like these little tricks and smoke and mirrors that's happening. That's how they plan on staying in power. But that's brittle, right? That's very brittle. And the Freedom Convoy was one of the first events that I remember. Peterson as well when I was in university. Like I went through the Red Terror period when I was in school. Like you couldn't say anything. I remember like talking about immigration in the early 2010s, and people were like, "You're a domestic terrorist." Okay, like that's what I got. That was how bad it was. I got
Wow,
I
and
got
you and
almost.
but the funny part is like you're kind of a you're somewhat exotic, right? Like before we started recording, your family are immigrants from Russia. You have a very exotic name. Like
Yeah,
you,
true, true. But
would
I'm
that?
a I'm a Montrealer. My first language is French. I speak French better than any other language. I went through what's called the Cursus Honorum. I'm a UBC grad, so I'm a very typical Canadian profile at the end of the day, right? Um, but I can use my brain and think about it and be like, you know what? Like you can't import people from all over the world and not assimilate them, not give them communities to integrate into, not make them Canadian in some ways. Like it took a second for me to realize that that was what was happening. And for example, I'm a Montreal kid, so when I went to UBC, I saw that 30% of my classmates were foreign students. I'm like, look, this is one of the best schools in the country. Like I know so many guys who would just kill to be here, just to get an opportunity at life to study at UBC. But you filled half the classrooms or a third of the classrooms with foreigners. Like, what's going on here? We've paid for this institution through our taxes. Our parents or grandparents have worked to pay for this thing, and you're giving it away to other people. Like I thought it was pretty outrageous to do that, right?
Right.
And of course, the arguments were like it's again the class thing. It's like you guys are Hicks. Well, you should be grateful to be here in the first place. And we actually need people from abroad to come and enrich and add diversity and intellectual power. It's like, well, no, we have a lot of guys who didn't go to university because they didn't have the means to, but you could have supported, and their parents and their grandparents, their grandparents put the money, paid the taxes for this institution, and you're literally telling them to go fuck themselves, right? I didn't think it was very fair at the time in the 2010s, but people weren't in a panic about immigration in 2010s. But I saw it in my own classes, like people were undermining Canadian identity at the time. They were undermining. When I say Canadian identity, I don't mean it like in like a abstract way. I mean, they literally look down on you as someone who's from here, who's grown up here, and I didn't think it was very fair. I didn't think it was very nice. I thought it was pretty outrageous that that was happening,
You know what's
right?
funny about that is the sort of the hypocrisy again of our Laurentian elitists and the sort of CBC Canadian types. This week, they found the guy that did the like "I am Joe Canadian" stupid
Mm,
beer commercial from 25 years ago. Like
mm,
you would have just been a little kid, but I watched that when I was a young man,
mm,
and everyone sort of wrapped their head around that and they thought it was great, and the hockey and being not American and all these
mm,
great things, and it was the sort of peak like of this sort of new Canadian identity thing, early 2000s.
mm,
And then Trudeau gets elected and goes to the New York Times, does an interview at the New York Times and says Canada has no identity, it's a post-national state. And he has a pedigree for this crap because his dad was like a communist, basically. Like, his dad tried to row a boat to Cuba, like a reverse thing from Florida to Cuba. Him and a buddy of his went to China. They wrote this book that was like they got the guided tour from Mao's people of all the good stuff, but not the other stuff. And so like whether or not Trudeau was actually fathered by Fidel Castro doesn't matter, because even if his adoptive father didn't father him, Pierre Trudeau is also basically a communist. And he does this post national thing, and now we're seeing the fruits of that project, right? Like, what's Canada? What are we even doing here? Like, and now all they can do is like whip up again. They go to the tired and true method of like whipping up animus and hatred against the Americans. And Trump, I don't know if this is to his credit or not, is just playing right along. Like, oh, I'm going to annex you guys. We're going to make you the beautiful 51st state. Trudeau would be a
Yeah.
much better governor. And like Donald Trump doesn't know shit about Canada. Like, stay in your lane, dude. But I'm not going to attack Trump as a replacement for not having my own sense of where I'm from or what I'm about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what I found really outrageous about like this like surge in Canadian nationalism is it's orchestrated by elite, and all the markers of Canadian identity are like all the hick stuff, which they hate. Like they literally spit down on all these things. They think it's retarded and stupid and boorish and provincial. But when the time comes to like agitate people, they just roll it back out. It's so transparent and I don't know, it's insulting. Like how can you take this level of insult and be like, all right, this is how we're doing things now? It's unacceptable.
All
Like at
right.
some point people have to put their foot down and be like, this is ridiculous. You
This
guys you
this
guys
is
are at
ridiculous and it's unacceptable, and we need a positive vision. So I've had you here for nearly 2 hours, and I want to wrap it up on a good note here.
yeah.
The positive vision in your article at IM 1776, the Arctic Gambit, which everybody that's listening to this should go read if you haven't already. Um, the development of the Arctic, the cooperation with the United States. Let's assume we get either regime change or the Laurentian elites see the light and correct the error of their ways and their current trajectory,
Mhm.
and we start doing it. What do we do to advance this project? What do we do to save Canada, and not in the way that CBC shitlib Canadians think is saving Canada? How do we do it? What's your roadmap?
Well, get together with a couple guys, open some beers, and start scheming on how you're going to take over your town. That's usually how it starts. And then don't worry, a lot of the guys from the provincial level will come and find you and talk to you, right? And you guys can actually orchestrate this at regional levels, municipal levels, provincial levels. And guess what? You can have your people in, and they'll be there. You just have to coordinate. You have to know what discipline is. You really want to have this will to like win, right? So you're gonna have to like get organized. You're gonna have to like close your mouth sometimes, shut up a little bit, and get in line and organize. Have a plan to start running your own towns, right? You can't outsource this to NDP communists. It's over. Like it's time to take over the town halls and the city halls and the government halls. Well, let's do it.
Right, right. Um, I think that's a good piece of advice rather than doom pilling and hanging out online all day.
Yeah.
Get into your local governance. I have a friend in Connecticut who's done that with the Republican Party, and
Hmm.
he's doing some pretty cool stuff in his part of Connecticut, and
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh,
fighting back against the local franchise operation of the Blob.
hmm.
And I'm trying to do my little part here to try and fix the trucking industry. I'm working with some guys in Arkansas. I mean, there's things you can do, and you can just do them. You can just do things, and
Absolutely.
in the doing of those things, you need a vision. And again, I hate to like blow you up
Mm.
or whatever, but I think like if there's a grand national vision for Canada that's not whatever this sclerotic identity politics, globo homo, we're going to save the world from climate change, scam garbage, turning Canada into a beige human resources slurry nothing. It should be that Arctic thing. Do the true North strong and free. Focus on the North part. Let's go north.
Awesome.
Right.
All right.
Sir, I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate your writing. How can people find you online?
I tweet at Avetis Muradyan on Twitter, and you can find me on LinkedIn as well. I'm a professional. I have a real job outside of Twitter, so I'm always happy to talk shop as well.
Right. And I'm going to share the links in the show notes. You've written extensively for the guys at Palladium. And then this most recent article at IM 1776. Thank you, Mark Granza, and all the rest of those guys. And downstream of this conversation, I'm now inspired to write something for them. So maybe I'll get to work on that.
Absolutely. They'll be happy to hear from you, I'm sure.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, hey man. Thanks very much, and way of the road.